Just comment. Are there any public comments? Go back, please, state your name and address. Back to the SQ.
Karen Norbeck, 800 East Geneseo. Good evening. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak at the beginning. I have a couple of comments from a member of the public point of view. I received notification of this meeting as a planning commission meeting at 2:07 yesterday. Not much time to read and assess the 69-page document. I checked the Lafayette listings page since it says meeting dates and documents will be added there. There was nothing about this meeting. Unlike other projects on this site, there is no way for the public to sign up to be notified about future meetings or new documents. I hope that is addressed ASAP. Luckily, I am signed up to get the planning commission's agendas, or it would have gotten past me, and I kind of pay attention to what's going on in the city. So I only had time to scan the document briefly, but I have some observations I'd like to share. First, there are some red flags popping up. Here's what I see. Clarification of public land dedications. I hope this means there will be an increase in land dedications and or that the cash in lieu amount will be assessed on a regular basis and raised as we do now with water. A reference to minimum private and or public open space. Open space is almost sacred here. There is no such thing as private open space. The suggestion of putting solar panels on open space land should be taken off the table. These are places to preserve nature and provide wildlife habitat, as well as giving the community a much needed place to escape from the built environment. Maybe I missed it, but will there be outreach to members of our Spanish-speaking community? Removing redevelopment barriers in Old Town. This does not sound positive in the least. I see a giant red flag regarding the development process and public input. I've watched the development process of city planning staff since the 1990s and battled with many of them. With all due respect to our current staff, I am not a supporter of the trust staff vibe I am getting. Staff come and go, and we have no idea who those future staffers might be. This feels like a plan. A plan is to diminish public input on something that could have a huge effect on residents' personal space. Our current process was created when members of the community continued to point out that there was such a rush to push developments through that the time for residents to research and craft their presentations to the Planning Commission and Council was not adequate. The development process was lengthened to allow for this. Even the words used in this section, such as targeting public input and limited, give me grief. As a member of the public, I hope to see words like enhance, improve, and highlight. And then I scroll down and see interim procedure updates identified by staff, and this statement, eliminating the use of public meetings. I realize our current staff was not here when the changes I just described happened, but wow, this made me groan and utter a few expletives out loud to the universe. I was a member of the Community Advisory Committee for the Comp Plan update and also the Citizens Advisory Committee for the 2003 update. So I'm looking at this document through those eyes. Some of you might be aware that I keep a watch on topics of interest to many in our community, and I am also looking out for those. With that in mind, some welcome positives I see. Wildlife protections and identifying important habitats. Our Open Space Committee and staff have been identifying those habitats for decades, and the PROS plan specifies and points to those areas of importance for future preservation. Wildlife-friendly design and dark sky-related regulations. More safety nets in the development process. Finding a balance between preserving local character and affordability, advocating for preservation of local historic landmarks, enhancing the tree canopy, pollinator districts, preventing displacement of people and businesses, improving connectivity, bicycle parking, transitions between neighborhoods, tiny homes, mobile home park zoning, connecting future land use decisions with local water usage. Something raised by community members over and over again is how can there be more building when we barely have water for current residents? Water needs and availability as well as infrastructure need to be factored in to all future development plans in a concrete way. I would also suggest police and fire services too. The community is looking at major increases in water rates due to past mismanagement. They will expect to see some strong controls here. I saw hundreds of previous staff reports for developments just saying, oh yes, we are good with water. We are not, and that is coming home to roost now. I have a blog about Lafayette, and the post that so far has received the highest number of subscribers by far was about House Bill 2024-1313 and the 72,000 more units staff estimated could be built in the city at that time. Comments were not positive. The state also stripped us of our managed growth amendment, but the support for it is still very high. I hope all the work done on this code update will still endeavor to reflect that desire from our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the public? Please, state your name and address, please.
Hi, Mr. Smith. My name is Ron Spalding, 1326 Colorado Way, Lafayette, Colorado. I wasn't going to speak tonight. I wasn't even going to come here, but this is very important. I miss Karen's presentation, but I 110% echo her concerns. The next point she brought up was about the water. And the state, the Midwest, nobody's really looking at it. I mean, I want to echo all the development going on here. Denver, Denver, the Cronkies and all going to redevelop all around the stadium. And we have our little old Lafayette. I live in Coal Creek Village, our water bill, and we were the baby HOA in this city that's initiated work with the city on a demonstration project on the berm. And we're going to probably save $20,000 worth of water last year and more this year in our little community. But here, when development's been coming in, we have the water. Yeah, we have to look at it really close. I don't know how we're going to survive the whole Midwest, the Colorado River pack. What's happened with that? It's a big issue. But our little town, managed growth, we're about built out. I don't know how much more acres we have and all, but we got to look at it really tight. And some of the cities have adequate public facilities ordinances. We don't. I don't know if it work here, but I'm really concerned for the future of the city because we're here, the whole state. It's all this talk. Nobody's really hitting them. Nobody's really threatening. And here, Lafayette's done a lot of good things. Let's look at that really tight. It's a big concern. So thank you.
Thank you. Other comments from the public? We do have some folks virtually this evening. Any comments from the public virtually?
I don't know if we have a member and our consultant, Elizabeth.
Just ask everyone to be mindful this evening to periodically look up to the screen to see if somebody has their hand raised. No other comments from the public. I'd like to turn the evening over to our long range plan.
Hi, good evening. Thanks so much for everyone's time today. I also want to thank Ron and Karen for your comments. Did want to make one note and apology for the notification. I think that there was a user error on my end. We typically notify and post these materials on the Lafayette List engagement page, and it looks like my attempt to do that when the packet went out a week ago, it happened. So that was like about 24 hours ago. It was supposed to go. So sorry for that, and made a note of it for future postings. But we are very excited to have a team here. The project has been on a bit of a hiatus for a few months now, and so this team has met 5 times before tonight. And so we've dug into our zone districts, initial code assessment from another team. We started looking at preliminary standards. We had a lot of detailed conversations around the Old Town residential area, a lot of conversations about what's been built there over the past 5 years. And so that's where we left it off last. And since then, we've decided to partner with Clarion Associates, and they were here. Some of you may recall the Old Town overlay district was made. They walked us through that process and drafted that for us. But with that said, before diving into this first agenda item, it's okay with you. Why don't we do a quick round the table, just your name, if you're from a board or a commission or a resident. And if you want to share anything else, go for it. But there's a lot of people, so we could keep.
From the Planning Commission.
I'm Seth White. I guess originally joined this group as a citizen at large, but apparently now I'm also a member of this Preservation Commission. starting soon.
Vicki Eland, I'm a president. Denise Walker with Human Rights Board.
Joe Smith, Vice Chair of the Planning Commission. My term ends at the end of this month. And I hope to find a way as a civilian to provide comment and maybe influence, in particular around solar gardens, solar opportunities in the community, just based on my work experience and knowing what the issues are around the country and hoping to help Lafayette to avoid this.
Commissioners, we have an opening on this committee, so there's residents. Be careful what you wish for.
Grant Swift, Open Space Advisory Committee, Board.
Bill Watson, Planning Commission.
Phillips Planning Commission, and I just want to echo Jim's concerns because it comes up over and over again in Planning Commission meetings when we're reviewing large commercial and even large residential developments, sustainability from the renewable energy perspective. It's not just solar, there are various other options. But I think we keep hitting that wall, being able to require developers to provide the conditions. And so now we're looking forward in this rewrite that's fairly substantial, robust section on sustainability. There's a lot of these different things. And that was one of the things I didn't see reading through what was provided, particularly the chapter layouts. So I guess the question would be, is that because you're planning on building it into each different chapter depending on the section? Or should there be literally be a sustainability section in the building? Thanks.
Bob Megan. I'm representing the Senior Advisory Board, replacing Guy Higgins, who is who's ending his term. And I did get these comments, these questions that we were going to be discussing, and I shared them with the Senior Advisory Board members in our meeting yesterday. So when it comes time for that, I have some things to share from our perspective.
Fatima Gurji, Planning Commission.
Mike Cooper with Boulder Creek Neighborhoods.
Ginola, Sustainability and Resilience Advisory Committee. I'll echo Frank's comments about missing sustainability throughout the documents we've seen. Like to see a little bit more on environmental impact statements, I guess, is kind of what we're used to, but maybe expanding that to hit resilience as well.
My name's Eliza. I'm an associate from.
And then I'm Gabby Hart. I'm a senior associate with Clarion.
We'll go online. Kate, you want to say hello? Here.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Kate Williams. I am a member of the Lafayette Urban Renewal Authority, which is winding down. So I don't know if at this point I'm at large or not, but.
Okay. Elizabeth.
And I'm Elizabeth Garvin. I'm a director with Clarion Associates in Denver. I'm a city planner and attorney, and I have been writing code updates for 30 years now. So it's kind of what I do all day. I'm really excited to join this group kind of midstream. So part of what we're doing this evening is getting acquainted and talking about this document that you've got in front of you, which is definitely not an all-in document and bound to make everyone unhappy for one reason or another. And we'll kind of talk through it and talk about where we're going from there.
That is that. We could probably go right into a brief staff presentation on these particular items relating to the schedule, introduction to the project, and engagement plan. We had some questions we'd like to kind of pause, have a discussion, and then dive into the assessment document in the same format. That sounds good. Okay. I'll go ahead and share my screen so everyone tuning in can see it. Okay. Elizabeth, are you presenting, or is this?
I'm presenting the first part, and then we'll switch to Gabby for the second part.
Perfect.
So Phil, if you'll go to the agenda slide, next slide. So this evening, we've started introductions and we're going to walk through the updated project schedule. We will talk about the public engagement plan and get some group discussion about that. And then we'll dive into the code assessment overview. Part of what we're looking for this evening is the feedback that we're already getting. So that's very exciting. Phil, I think we can skip the next slide, introductions. We kind of did that. And let's go down to working group roles and expectations. So we know we're joining this project with you guys having done some work. And so we want to check in about where you think your role should be and where kind of where we all come together. So from the perspective of the city's consultant, the thing that everyone in the room brings to the table is your knowledge of Lafayette and your years that you've been there, the boards that you've been on, the committees and the neighborhood organizations, and just being a citizen. And so it doesn't sound like we have any shrinking flowers on the group, but just to let you know, we are always looking for your input and we appreciate it. One of the things what we'll be asking about in terms of regulations is how do we make this type of regulation in any category work for Lafayette? The way that we get to a functional and useful code is to write it so that it works bearing in mind your staff capabilities, your citizen preferences, what's going on in the comprehensive plan. And so with every type of regulation that we look at, there's usually more than one way to do it. And we want to make sure that we provide the right way to do it that works in Lafayette. The way we do that is bring you different options and choices and talk to you about the pros and cons of doing this one way or another and look for feedback from you. Outside of working within the drafts, we will ask you to help guide our outreach messaging so that we can reach the community, so that we are making sure that we're hitting on important topics for people. Sometimes land development regulations can be incredibly dry and dusty and jargony. And we don't want something important to slide by the community because it sounds like Charlie Brown's teacher when we put it out there, you know, wah, wah, wah. So we want to make sure that we're using words that have impact in the community, that we are letting people know this is something that we really are looking for their feedback on. We don't want you to worry about drafting or editing the code. We are not going to stop you from editing. We plan on doing most of the initial drafting based on the input that you give us, and then redrafting based on your feedback. We will have public versions of the code online for everyone to comment on, and we will make a version available for the working group to comment on. So we will talk through just about everything. And if if it's your preference to do line edits or word edits, there will certainly be an opportunity for that. Working as a group, we want to make sure that we hit on key issues and that we don't get stuck in the weeds of whether somebody wants something to say meaningful or substantial. And we'll have those conversations too, but just letting you know that we're looking for your feedback, we're looking for your comments, and as a group, being able to converse about that is one of the most important things that you guys can bring to the project to help guide us on. The other thing that we prefer to do is not vote up or down on content. We like to work closer to consensus. If we find ourselves stuck on something and we have a significant minority opinion, we'll figure out how we want to capture that to make sure that we are sending it on to Planning Commission and City Council. But as we're in the document, we want to keep working towards language that we think is going to be beneficial and useful, and not stop the process, vote it out, and carry on. So that's our group roles and expectations. I'm actually going to stop for a second and ask if there's anything here that you agree with, that you really just want to underline, or if there's anything that you don't see here that the group has agreed to about expectations that we should be aware of.
So Lafayette has, most municipalities do, a number of different sub-plans, you might call them.
Mhm.
There is the open space plan or the traffic plan or whatever. And some of these have been fairly recently updated as well as the comp plan. Now, when you're creating the new language, what would be helpful is that you have new language that you can reference. Say, this came from this code, this came from here, this came from the comp plan, because otherwise you're putting us in the position of having all these plans and then looking, what's your language? Okay, where's it coming from, or does it cover this? And I kind of think that's sort of what we're hiring you for. So please include that.
We have staff from all the departments that have those plans, pros, public works, so on, that are working kind of behind the scenes to identify all those policies incorporated. That includes the climate action plan, wildlife plan as well. So that's something that's definitely happening.
Okay, and you're also going to include the Boulder County Vision Zero Action Plan that we're sitting in on.
Yeah.
Our meetings, okay.
Great, thank you. So the way I hear that is if we are doing work that we want to really flag to you, hey, the source of this new approach is from the open space plan, or it's from, some climate action and resilience policies that we're looking at. It would be easier for you guys to follow why we put new stuff in, to know that it's coming out of one of the many plan documents that the city uses to reflect policy. Got it.
Yeah, I don't see any there.
Okay, so here's our approach. And we will work out our approach together as we go. We start by letting you know that we do listen and learn. Sometimes we may spend more time talking about something than perhaps the entire group wants to, because it is important to us to engage with all of the ideas that you bring to the process. And we may want to talk something all the way through that you think is obvious. It's not always obvious how we move policy into regulation. And so sometimes we want to understand all of the aspects around the issue. So we will listen, we will learn, we will ask questions, and then we will come back to you with language and see if we've captured what the city wants to do. Our job is to supplement your knowledge with our experience. So usually the way it works is you share an idea with us, something that came through the planning process, or that has been successful in other communities, or you just woke up in the morning and thought, gee, why don't we put a conservation easement over this? Let's figure out how to do that. So we take that all in, we work it back through into the regulations, and then we talk through how it works and revise it based on that. Our other job is to facilitate tough conversations and identify policy level issues. When you are working in a community that's as sophisticated as Lafayette is, we are inevitably going to have strong feelings on different sides of the same opinion or the same approach. And so our job is to either facilitate or mediate to get to a place where we are in the regulations where not everybody agrees, and that's definitely not going to be one of the outcomes of a code update process, but where we all know why we're moving forward on a topic, and that it will meet the needs of the community. I also, as part of that, this whole idea that I touched on a second ago, taking policy level issues and turning them into regulations is not a one-for-one equation. And so we'll be talking about the different permutations of how we move from policy to regulation to make sure that we're getting there in the right way. Should we decide that we need more guidance at a policy level, we may well send issues back up to Planning Commission or City Council for that. We try to stay out of the lane of making new policy. We just want to implement policy. Phil, let's do the next slide, please. Although I didn't see Bob the Builder moving there. I guess in PDF he's locked down. So another time we'll bring our Bob the Builder with us. So let's take an overview of the project. So we're starting out with 4 goals. This is based on everything that we've looked at in the comp plan, looked at in the project as it's gone forward so far. We have had some really engaged conversations with staff about kind of hopes and dreams and expectations for this project. And so we will refine these goals through our next few meetings, and then we'll use them as our guidance for what we're doing with the code. So if we get stuck somewhere, we'll back up and say, are we meeting a project goal? Are we moving the dial on something? So at a really high level, we want to implement Legacy Lafayette. We want to implement all of the other plans that are important to land use decisions. For our purposes, we kind of call Legacy Lafayette the umbrella, but we will make sure that we're bringing everything else in. We want to make the land use code more user-friendly and easier to understand. So I'm going to stop here. You guys probably already know this. It is going to be a legal document. It is never going to be like reading Winnie the Pooh, but we will do our best to make sure that the language is accessible, that the instructions are easy to follow, and that the information in there can be understood by people who need to use the code. One of the other goals that we're shooting for is to make sure that the city sees more predictable development outcomes. And we do that through updating regulations so the standards are clear, straightforward, and so the review criteria that set the expectations for the applicant of what the city is looking for are spelled out within the code. And then finally, we want to right-size the development review process. And what we mean by this is we want to make sure that we have public input at the right location in the process. Sometimes that's really not at the hearing. It should be earlier when the project is more malleable and can be redesigned without significant cost to the applicant. We want to make sure that the code itself sets some clear expectations for the applicant. And then we want to make sure that smaller projects that are kind of that 70 to 80% of what comes through the city have a really clear and relatively speedy process for review. There should certainly be an off-ramp for complex projects. There should be help for smaller projects. But we want to make sure that where the city doesn't need to give a lot of individual attention on the part of staff and a part of planning commission to a project because that project meets the regulations that the city has set as a community, then the projects can go through. That's a discussion across the length of this drafting process. And we will talk about in different places, are we doing the community input in the right location? Are we doing the right kind of community input? Are we letting the applicant know what their expectations are and what they need to do with their project? So these are the larger goals, and they'll play out in multiple ways throughout the drafting process. Phil, next slide. So here's our timeline. And you can see we did some background project restart that was primarily internal with staff trying to get up to speed. We're trying to make sure that we are respectful of the time that both this group and the citizens have put into the project. And so we don't spend a lot of time just reopening things, and we move forward into the drafting process. One of the things that we've learned is that we do spend some time on this code assessment, just making sure that we've set a framework for the project. But we don't spend a lot of time perfecting the code assessment. That's not time best spent in getting a code put together. The code assessment is kind of level 1, and then we go deeper for all of the drafting we do. So I want everyone in the room to know that, you know, we'll go through the code assessment this evening and we'll take your feedback. We use that to feed into the drafting process. And there really won't be a code assessment that is revised to reflect all of the comments, but the comments will be posted so the community can see the feedback that we're getting. Then we check the comments, we check the working group information as we do drafting, and we try to incorporate that into our drafting process. Big picture, we're going to do 2 drafts. So we're going to do a technical draft first. So this will be a primarily internal draft in that we're not going to give it to the community and say, please comment on part 1 while we still haven't drafted part 3. We want to draft all 3 parts and get to a complete code, which is a much more effective and efficient way for people to comment. We want to minimize public frustration about things that they might want to talk about that require us to have drafted the full code. So we'll work with staff and working group to get the full code drafted and ready for detailed public review and comment. During that time, we will certainly unearth issues that we want to reach out to the comment and talk to the public and talk about. Usually we come up with, you know, 4 to 6 issues in any module that we draft. So module is kind of a chunk of code that we put together. And so as we're putting the internal draft together, we'll be taking key issues. These are usually policy implementation issues back to the public and seeking feedback. So as we have that revised version together, we have preliminary public comment, we have preliminary feedback from the community, and then we have a full draft to put out. So that will be from December of this year into June of next year. Then starting in July of next year, so that's the first half is drafting. The whole second half of the year is public comment and public review. We will go deep on this. I will talk in a couple slides about the different techniques that we'll use to reach out to the public, and each time we'll be asking, you know, what more could we do? So we will take enough time for everyone to learn about the project, to learn what's in the project, and to comment on the project comfortably. And then we will take that information and work it into a revised draft that has both working group information and public information. We will continue to work with the working group as the public information comes back, because we'll want to see if what we're hearing is in alignment with the planning work that the city's done and with what we've done in the drafting so far, and be able to let people know if their comments will be rolled into the draft, or if not, the reasons why not generally. So we want to be respectful of the time that other people put into this project. So that's how we'll work that public outreach piece of it. Let's go to the next slide. So to get to the public engagement, Phil, let's go, thanks. We have, you know, the different strategies that we use. We know some things have been successful in Lafayette. We are interested in trying a few other things. So the groups that we want to reach out to, we have specific community interests that we want to reach out to. The City Council, City Planning Commission, the working group, residents and business owners, community organizations, developers, and HOAs, and regional partners. This list will likely grow. The different communication channels that we'll use are the web and video. So we've got the project website up. We'll use social media primarily to notify people about what's going on in the project, similar with email blasts. And then we'll work to use print and online media for people, print for people who want prefer that, you know, document that they want to look at, or aren't as adept at accessing things online, or aren't able to access things online. And so we're going to try to meet people with content in a variety of ways. We know we all learn differently. And so we want people to be able to interact with this code more than just, hey, here are hundreds of words on hundreds of pages. Some of our engagement strategies are going to be community-based meetings, so city events, mobile engagement. We'll do briefings with groups. We'll do listening sessions. We will also do smaller group meetings so we can do, take a walk with a planner. We will do some focus groups. We'll have some coffee chats. I'm always a fan of caffeine and food. And I think my colleagues and Phil are with me on that one. So we'll make sure that it's open and inviting. We know that sometimes it can feel like a lot, for a community member to come in and talk about a code that they don't interact with regularly. So we know that it's our job to meet people where they are and make this process as inviting as possible. We'll also do community-wide meetings. It's always interesting to hear how the community interacts without being led or being, spoken with by staff or the consultants. Sometimes there are really interesting conversations that come out from neighbors speaking to each other. And then we'll do things that allow individual responses, so mailed and online surveys and interviews. So again, the idea here is to take a bit of everything in terms of engagement, align it with the group and the desired outcome. So why do we use a strategy? What are we looking for? And then make sure that we have multiple ways for the community to participate. Let's do the next slide.
I'll make one quick comment, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
One thing that I think we have struggled with the project so far is like, how do you take this code and actually like comment on it in a way that isn't too cumbersome? And so one of the things that we'll have with this project is a web-based app that'll have the document, but a really easy way for individuals in the community to just press a button and it adds a comment and a comment bubble comes up. And the app itself also has additional functionality like AI powered, where you could say, how does bicycle parking handled? And it'll say it's handled in these sections in these ways, and it'll hyperlink to the document. And so it's a pretty sophisticated but really interesting tool that we have set up and ready for when we start to code.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, we like working with that tool, Conveo, and it takes a minute to get into it and learn it. And then if anyone needs a hand, once you get going, just let us know. But it is exactly like Phil says, pretty much, drop a comment in and the comments are shared. So you can see how other people are commenting also. And the site is moderated. Okay, I think this is my last slide. And so this is where we want to ask, does anyone want to weigh in about how engagement has gone previously or how engagement has gone in any planning process? Do you have, suggestions for us? One of the things that we try to stay really cognizant of is having people show up at hearings at the end of the project and saying, I didn't know this was happening and I was caught off guard. And so, short of knocking on every door, that is going to be the result for some people, but we do want to do our very best to say there's a place for you to be involved and let people know about that. So some feedback from the group. What are you thinking? Are you okay with what we're talking about? And what suggestions do you have?
Elizabeth?
So Lafayette recently has gone through quite an effort to align the initiation of all the boards and commissions at the same time through the year. And historically, there have been times where a project or an effort has come to culmination right on the cusp of a new city council or a new board. And I would just say that the timing of the deliverables should be appropriate such that a new entity is in place with time to review and vote instead of it's presented at this meeting and the next meeting a new council takes over.
Yep. Thank you. Yep, that is downtime teaching everybody again. That's great. We'll be cognizant of that for sure.
Then part two is, saw that the schedule ended in January 6th, but what is the anticipated planning commission review, city council review period? Are we thinking that's a 3-month, 6-month process or to be determined?
Yeah, it'll be up. I know sometimes, so when we get there, we were thinking in the first quarter, 2026, so February, getting up to planning commission, depending, ideally we resolve the issues and everyone's there and it's a celebration of adopting a code. But there could be a lot of public comment, and sometimes that means bifurcating meetings and having public comment and then 2 weeks later, so when we get to that point, it'll be a little bit flexible, I think, with what the need is of the planning commission and council.
I think in terms of as we get into the formal adoption process, one of the things I think that we didn't focus on here is during that larger public feedback process, we do like to start workshopping it with planning commission. So not as formal as adoption, but we like to, where the agenda allows us to kind of slide in and take up some time. We preview everything for everybody. We give you time to think about your thoughts and comments that you might want to come back with, take guidance along the way. So we definitely don't want to slam into adoption, which I think is what Phil was saying. And we'll build that schedule out in detail kind of as we come around the corner of the new year, I think.
Yeah, I'm looking at your schedule, and I guess what I'm having trouble with is your public review draft goes through early 2026, so March of 2026. But your public review draft editing and finalization ends in September of 2025. So if you're having these public meetings after that and input comes in, is the incorporation of that input cut off at that point? And if it's not, what is the iterative process for the other groups like Planning Commission or this group to review those suggested changes, determine whether that's going to be finalized? Because this could sort of get to a terminal loop here. Just trying to see how this works based on your schedule.
Yeah, so
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
oh, okay. What we want to do is if we have a conflict between the timeline I've got on the timeline slide and the detailed timeline, my apologies for that. We do want to take in all the public comment to a point. We will set that point as we get ready to start public comment. And we will continue to work with the working group during the time that we're doing public comment. At some point, when we all decide that we are comfortable, that we've reached out to the public, that we've heard thoughts and ideas, that we may be down to, still a few places of disagreement, we will stop the editing process and create an adoption draft. We like for the adoption draft to be static through the adoption process, because it gets confusing to people if we try to make changes during the adoption process. So those actual deadlines will probably be something that we start talking about mid-year with the working group, with staff, and with Planning Commission and City Council, mid-year 2025. So everyone is kind of aware of where we want to go. I would love if we could set absolute deadlines, but we try to stay a little flexible just because something always comes up that is worth the time and effort to get it right before it goes into adoption. So I think that if this isn't clear, I apologize for that, but that's how we typically do that. Gabby, were you going to say something else to that?
Well, I was just gonna say if you're looking at the graphic of the more detailed schedule, what might be confusing is the draft that's going to the adoption, like the little stars, that would be one that has been updated based on the feedback we've been getting on the public review draft. That's the confusing part. So there is a modified draft after that public review draft. The public review draft, it's the big one for the public to look at and review and comment on. We look at that, and then we make all those changes and bring that into the adoption process. So, we can maybe work on this graphic if we have it up elsewhere and add that step in there. .
On the community engagement plan, a few different thoughts. First, I noticed you have the different levels of engagement and form consultant while collaborating. Great. I noticed that a lot of the types of groups you mentioned in the table say that they're going to be involved, which I'm sure they'll appreciate rather than just being informed. However, also it's probably pretty important to have a plan to get back to them with how you incorporated the feedback, how you happened and why. So I don't know if that's already part of the plan, but I think that would be very helpful. Also, I wondered with your focus groups in particular, if you considered compensation for participants. I know in the community engagement space, there's a lot of discussion about the best practice to enable folks to participate who might not otherwise be able to participate. So something to consider. And similarly, in some of the meetings, offering childcare might be really valuable just to allow kids to attend. And also, on the one-on-one interviews as a strategy, I wanted to suggest that there may be certain elements of the plan as this thing develops that really have impact on some specific people or some specific parcels, and making an effort to conduct one-on-one interviews with those folks who might have outsized impact might be really smart. And they weren't specifically listed on your list. Maybe they were intended to be included, but I think that could be very and that's, yeah, I don't, maybe I'll save, are we going to talk about review procedures later? Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah,
I just want to.
Let me jump in on that for 1 second, because what we haven't touched on is we are actually teamed with Root Policy Research, because there will be some affordable housing aspects of the project. We definitely with them on other projects have done the compensation for participation and childcare, particularly, as we need to get people involved whose lives don't let them drop everything to join us for a couple hours. So we will be cognizant of that and use those tools to make sure that we are getting good input on the project. Thanks for bringing that up.
We did that. So Root Policy Research will be doing some housing pieces of this. They did our housing plan, and then we did paid. I think it was a paid survey in that case. Good response.
I was just going to add that the public engagement locations should be in various places throughout the city, as opposed to just this building. But the library, the rec center, places like that, they're a little more inviting.
We agree. Thank you.
I had Jack Johnson on when we started the meeting. Be inviting.
A couple things. I think it's a good public engagement plan. Something that I thought I read is that if the meetings with the public would be 2 to 3 months, and that seemed short to me. One of the biggest things with these plans is people saying that they didn't hear, they don't know. And 2 to 3 months is a pretty tight time frame. One of the things that I thought worked really well that Clarion worked on was the Old Town codes. Postcards were sent out for to every residence for large meetings or something like that. I'm not sure if it's going through social media or Lafayette traditional communication channels, how many people see that. Water bills, for instance, people in HOAs don't see that, so as many ways as it can get in front of everybody. There was a line in there that said, collect public comment, answer questions, and forward relevant suggestions to staff and the working group. No problem with relevant suggestions. I mean, who's going to determine that? I think that all suggestions, all public input should be forwarded. I mean, people don't have to read them, but I think they should be available to staff in the working group.
Yeah, so just to clarify on that, sometimes because we're asking members of the public to comment on this regulatory process, we do get comments that are not addressed in the land development code or land use code. So we'll get comments about sewer expansion, or we'll get comments about building permit issues. So we will share back with the public all of the comments, and we will share back that, hey, we didn't address this one. This is a building code issue. We can't deal with this in the land use code. So that's our level of sorting. The rest of it is a conversation. It's a conversation with working groups, conversation with staff. So we don't see our place as deciding something is not relevant, but we do always find that just because development can be, very opaque process, people will comment on things that we can't address in this process.
Yeah, and following up on our discussion of the public engagement plan, at our senior advisory board meeting last night, we had two comments that we'd like to present to the group. One is more of a generic one, and I'll just read it. We asked that our Land Development Code Working Group look at permitting through the eyes of aging adults who are increasingly looking to age in place. That's a very profound statement, and to break it apart, maybe I could give a for instance, because we got into this. Let's take the issue of ADUs, which is a proposed topic for developing the land. From the perspective of aging adults or people who are mobility challenged, right now I think the current code says, 750 foot is the per square feet is the maximum for an ADU. Just from that perspective, what can 750 foot do if there are one or more than one person in a wheelchair? So let's supposing these people also need a caregiver. How is anyone going to be able to function effectively at 750 square foot? Now, that's just for instance, we're into a little bit of a building code, but in land use, if we're taking a look at that and we're serious, let's consider horizontal as well as vertical development for ADUs. And so that's just a for instance. So that's the first comment. And then secondly, on the public engagement, York and Ms. Norbeck, some people would be interested in hearing what's going on here. And we came up with 4 constructive comments that we could plug into your engagement plan here. And the first one is look at our senior center at 103 South Vermont. That is a very active location, and we host many events there. Consider hosting an event. The way you get on the calendar is every month we publish a spotlight. Now, there are over 900 recipients for this spotlight each edition. That would be a great way to disseminate to the older adults who are interested in what's happening at the senior center and getting a message across and what we are trying to do with issues that may affect my older adult lenses here, those of us who are wanting to stay in Lafayette and age in place and find an appropriate, affordable, like that comment that's going to be another part too. So there are so many issues here, but so that's the first. And I guess in the second one too. Third, consider online options whenever you have an event. At all our board meetings, we have a Zoom option for people who can't get there, like you have right here. So I think that's a real consideration for any meeting where you're looking for comment and having an owl here and allowing the people to interact, those who can't come in person. And then lastly, a personal visit to our various meetings, senior advisory board, any of the different meeting groups, I think would be very much appreciated. If you could get on our calendar, and when you have something to share from whatever it is, whether it's the open space or yeah, whatever sustainability, whatever group that you're in. So those are the items that we discussed and wanted me to share with you this evening. Thank you.
That's great. We will certainly reach out to AARP has amazing resources for aging in place. And so we know that, you know, they have some model regulations. They have gotten deeply into city planning over the last 5 years or so. And so we'll look to see what we can learn from other communities that will help address how we can keep people comfortably at home as long as they want to be there.
You got it.
Yeah, I guess this is more of a question than a comment, but with regards to the engagement process, and there's this category of resident, but I'm a renter, and so as I'm reading this, my question was, is there a role or a plan for reaching out to renters? Because resident tends to assume, I think, property owner, people who own homes that they want to, you know, age in place in, or business owners. And yet, you know, I live in a senior resident, you know, it's an apartment complex, 55 and older. And, you know, we could easily host a group of you, you know, a meeting with you all, but I'm not sure people would see the relevance, or why should I show up? I'm a renter, you know, I'm kind of just at the mercy of whatever everybody decides. And I'm not quite sure, other than, and the part of Lafayette I live in is surrounded by other multifamily rental places. So there's these huge complexes around us. We're all the way down at the end of Public Road, just before you run into the hospital. So there's just nothing but housing and stuff. And so I'm just wondering, like, how do renters fit into this engagement process and the land use discussion, you know, writ large?
Talking about Prana, right?
Well, yeah, Prana and.
So all of those have very nice clubhouses.
Mhm.
And if you schedule that and send out something to all the residents.
Yeah, I think it's not so much that, but what's the relevance for renters? Why will they show up? Why would they want to, you know,
So yeah, we
all this process to begin with?
Milk and cookies.
yes, exactly. They'll show up because there will be food. We try really hard. In fact, I'll just go out on a limb. We try damn hard to not differentiate renters and owners. That's not a discussion that works well in a land use code setting, because each group is important within the community, simply because your relationship to property is that you pay someone else to stay on their property doesn't mean that you care less about your community. And so those conversations are things that we want to start early. People who rent in Lafayette are residents. People who own in Lafayette are residents. And the more we can do to get everybody at the table, the more that benefits the regulatory process. So if it's milk and cookies in your meeting room in the building, or, you know, around the, you know, wherever anyone hangs out outside, yes, we want to be there. We see time and time again renters getting the wrong end of the conversation as we go through a code update, because there are assumptions kind of baked into who cares about their property and who doesn't care about their property. And those assumptions are absolutely incorrect. So we are super happy that you're here and raising this question. And that's kind of a door we'll keep pounding on as we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think the messaging is what's really important, is here's why you should care, and here's why we want to talk to you
Yeah.
and tell you what we're doing. To push back against that sense that,
Yep.
you know, nobody really cares. We're kind of at the mercy of market forces and property owners, and there's not much else we can do.
And hopefully this engagement plan provides a toolkit. So like when we
Yeah.
are getting ready, which one of these would really resonate, like be a good strategy to be able to reach out to certain segments. Is that?
Yeah, I had a couple comments on points 3 and 4 on the screen. One, number 4, the answer is yes. Actually with Clarion in Lafayette, and I'm glad you guys are here. It actually went well, successful, well done, and especially on the outreach part, I thought it was pretty good. So I'm kind of anticipating the same thing this time. And on that point, to address number 3 there, how to minimize that nobody knows what's happening. Well, you're always going to get some of that no matter what you do, but you know, the social media, the emails, the events, the open houses, the webinars, whatever, those are all great, but the only way you can guarantee, and this is probably obvious, but just saying it out loud, you know, the only way you're going to guarantee that you get in front of the face of every person in Lafayette is direct mail. And I know that's part of your plan. I don't know if you're planning on sending something to every address or not, but that's really the only way that you could say, look, we sent out this and we did that. And, you know, and you will reach everybody.
And there were multiple posts.
Yes.
Yeah, so not just one.
I don't remember if we had direct mailings, but we do use the newsletter quite often. Everyone here reads their newsletter.
The water that comes with your water bill.
There's like a one pager.
Right, but
We don't get those.
yeah, people who don't get a water bill.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So,
Yeah, it's that's the only thing. It's tedious, but we've got mailing lists, stack postcards. It's not easier said than done. I don't have to do it, but that's the only way. Right, you know.
Yeah, and would add texting. That wasn't on the list, but that's growing as a strategy, and peer-to-peer texting is really interesting too. And there's some interesting software platforms that allow for that. So in other words, like you send a text to a set of phone numbers you have, and you encourage those folks to make it easy for them to text it to their friends, and that has a greater adoption rate sometimes. And I was wondering also about the banners.
yeah.
There's an opportunity to use some of this.
We did texting for the 2020 census. We did like Spotify for all the college kids, but yeah, we have some discussions about trying some new stuff. We are getting to about an hour in now. If others have thoughts before we went on to the next. This is the first conversation, so I think before we go out to the community, we'll have check-ins with y'all. Through some of that. Make sure that y'all are able to. Okay.
Thanks for the great
Thanks.
input.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to cover just an overview of the code assessment document that you all were sent for your packets. Again, like Elizabeth said, you know, what this is us looking at the land use code, at all of the materials that have been worked on up until this point, and really just from our perspective, seeing where we think that the code can be improved. We do consider this a basic framework, a basic roadmap for where we're going, but that does not mean that everything that is written in here is set in stone, nor does that mean things that might not be written in here can't come up during the process. It's really just an initial look at here's what we see based on what we've read, based on what we know and what we've experienced through writing codes through other similar communities, and where we can go from there. So that's really the intent of the code assessment. So I'm just gonna go through an overview, but I know I already heard that some of you have comments and I want to get to those. So I'll get through it and then we can do questions at the end. But so the document is organized somewhat like a code, actually. So we begin with zoning districts. And what we want to do here is we know that you all have done a lot of great work and intentional work already. And we're not eliminating that. We're not throwing that away. We're going to build off of that. So some general concepts to reevaluate. The overuse of PUD, moving away from that, moving away from using PUD as kind of a tool for variances and really shifting more towards just straight based zoning districts and making sure that those districts have the dimensional standards and the use standards that get different parts of the community to where they want to be. We do want to establish thresholds for those form-based standards. And then also try and address existing nonconformities through these changes. And so that also has to do with the map that will end up going with this code. It'll be a new map based on the new zoning districts. So, and then in general, we do want to expand the range of residential housing options throughout Lafayette. Next would be the use regulations. So just in general, reviewing and updating the current ones and moving away from the overuse of special use reviews. And in order to sort of find that balance of, maybe we don't need a full, city council or planning commission review of something, but we do need some set standards that staff need to make sure a use is meeting. So things like sound impacts, if there's hours of operation that need to be limited, if screening of outdoor storage needs to happen, those sorts of things, rather than just sending everything to special use review for those types of impacts to be looked at. So really reserving that process for very specific types of development that need that extra level of review. And then also on a usability standpoint, usability of the code, ensure that every use has a clear definition, and then also creating a process for interpreting unlisted uses for staff if that comes up.
So right now, there's a lot of ambiguity, and we want, when there is ambiguity, a clear process for the applicant and staff to just figure it out, and, not go around.
Next is site and building standards. So knowing that Lafayette does have a significant amount of opportunity for infill and redevelopment, really trying to make sure that the site and building standards are sensitive to that and contextual to that. And then also, as the comprehensive plan encourages mixing of uses, and when we set that up in the zoning districts, we also want to make sure that we're sensitive when designing development that's different next to each other, that there's good transition standards. If you're moving from more of a low density residential neighborhood into maybe a little bit more commercial, and trying to figure out how to smooth those transitions and again just limit impacts. Other new standards to explore for site and building, requiring a mix of housing types and design variations, looking at building orientation, so that interface with the street and pedestrians, and making things a bit more walkable. The building massing, so making sure that new development or redevelopment, and especially infill, is contextual and compatible. And then also specific to residential, the potential to look for garage variety and location. Next, so natural resource protection and climate resiliency. So this includes a variety of things. So first and foremost, we want to figure out how to protect and preserve wetlands and riparian areas. This portion of the code would also include flood protections. Trying to look a little bit more at how we can get stormwater management standards into the code, or sort of acknowledged in the code, working with the city's engineering team with that. Finding ways to protect and enhance the city tree canopy is something that we've heard a lot about. And then obviously with the new climate action plan and wildlife plan, incorporating those types of policies as well. And then also going along with this, dark skies, also involved in this. You asked a question earlier about, in the code, is there just one section or chapter that is, sustainability, or is it incorporated throughout? We've done it both ways. Sometimes the hard part about making it all in one section is, like solar can be like a use. So usually we put those standards in the uses. But the goal is to have it be a theme and addressed throughout the code. Not necessarily one main section. So that's why you might not have seen that, but we are very aware of, how important that is for Lafayette. And, we'll try and find any opportunities we can to get those sorts of things in there. And I think it'll be helpful to have the staff's evaluation of the climate action plan. We'll have a lot of that in it too. So
Very large document. Lexi, Lizzie, Dennis, and others have helped. So we've kind of pulled out everything relevant to those plans and getting it to.
Reading over the document, I see a lot of recommended. Can we make, instead of recommending, like recommended dark sky, just required? Is that a possibility? As far as solars, can we make that required? Since we're, talking about water, my big concern is dealing with HOAs. And I leave my neighborhood, it's all dead lawns. Across the street in the HOA, there's water flowing down the street and green lawn. I've always thought that city is a greater power than an HOA, but I never see us as planning commissioner, the city saying to HOAs, no, you can't have a golf course, green lawn. I don't know if we can address that.
There's a bill that was passed this last session that prohibits cities from allowing functional turf to be used. And so we are working with another firm, partnership with Clarion, to do the landscaping ordinance a little bit sooner, even sooner. The accelerated timeframe. That'll include implementing that plan. That's something that will be included in the project.
The landscaping ordinance is predominantly commercial.
This applies to HOA, those HOA areas.
Oh,
the
so
law
they're-
does.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we can't apply them to individual houses in a housing.
I think it's a policy decision. How much do you get onto it? How much regulation do you put on that individual single family house?
Right.
Backyard or front yard? That's probably a big decision.
But that's my point. With people living in HOAs, I'm sure they don't want to be using $200 worth of water. Then you have an HOA association here in Lafayette, where you have to be on. And that's where I have a hard time wrapping my head around why the city can not say to the HOAs, if somebody wants to let their lawn go dormant in July and August. I don't know if that would be something we can have here.
yeah,
I might be getting into the weeds a little bit too much, but
and I don't know if Elizabeth is on or not. She has a much, there we go. I was gonna say
Mayor.
the attorney, please, will you answer the
No.
HOA?
Yeah, the one point in the night where I'm useful. So you guys may have talked about this. The city can set any land use standards that it's allowed to do by state statute. An HOA represents a private agreement among the property owners, and so that can have standards that are more strict than the city's standards. And because it is a private agreement between property owners, cities don't usually weigh in on those changes, provided what the HOA is doing is not illegal. That's a different area of law than we're working in the land use code. The legislature, as Phil was saying, has started stepping in a little bit. They've done it with the non-functional turf grass, and I believe in some of the ADU legislation also. So that is going to be the city's best protection for making some changes within HOAs. The state saying it doesn't matter what your agreement was, we're overriding that. I know that there are some places where cities do weigh in looking at what deed restrictions are going to go on the property, what covenants, and how the HOA is going to be set up to make sure that it doesn't work against basic local policy. And that's something certainly we can talk to the city attorney about going forward. For the HOAs that are in place, we will be kind of wrestling down that question of if we can unwind the PUD, what happens with the HOA? And we're going to have to put a pause on that one and get back to you guys at a future meeting after we've looked at what other communities have done and talked about what the city attorney is confident in doing.
Thank you.
Just to add on that, I mean, I have seen the state put in some significant changes to existing covenants. You know, for example, signs was an issue a few years ago, and the state overrode sign regulations from HOAs. They also recently put in fire unfriendly fencing. You know, hard fencing as opposed to wood fencing was another thing that came through the state. So
I'll say, as someone who lives in an HOA, the rising water bill costs have got the attention of many HOAs, and they are finally, after decades, being proactive in addressing excessive water use.
Yeah, and some of those HOAs also recognize that their systems are failing, and so they're going around and preparing them to be more water wise. The entire Indian Peaks HOA, which I live in, redone the entire irrigation system to use 50% less water because their system is really bad. So they'll have problems and aware of the water issue, and they're doing their best to. The other part about it is there are parts of right of ways which populated because it's part of the look and feel of a neighborhood, but they're letting those go because they're actually feed up. Yeah, so we're seeing larger communities.
This just feeds into the water usage.
Yeah.
10 years down the road.
I had a comment when you mentioned that the city was going to be looking at in the landscaping plan. I'd like you to refer back to the wildlife plan on page 115 because they've got recommendations.
Yep. Yeah, the person writing that does have the wildlife recommendations.
Mr. Spalding?
I know I'm not supposed to talk, Mr. Smith, but I just want to say that the city has initiated, the city has had through the same sustainability coordinator, 2 HOA meetings addressing these topics in the library. There have been 2 meetings that invitations went out to all the HOAs in Lafayette and surrounding communities. And the first one was very well attended. In fact, both of them were pretty good attended. Indian Peaks was there, Coffee Village, a bunch of others. And second meeting was hosted, we had Northern Water come down talking about these topics and trying to give advice, and it's to the HOAs, structure, better the irrigation, the xeriscaping, whatever you want to call it. It's to continue. So through I think it's the sustainability coordinator, and it's to continue, and it was very good. And so we're starting to see the HOA jump aboard to help themselves, because you're right, the water. But, so that has started. It's been 2 meetings. Thank you.
When somebody comes to the city, a developer with a housing development, large scale housing development, and we look at it, how it code, et cetera. And then after it's approved and it starts to get built, then an HOA starts to come into effect. So the question would be, what are the rules that we can enforce during that planning approval process? Then the HOA can't override, because again, they're an add-on after the development is existing to manage it.
We can certainly look at
So
that.
their rules are written later.
Yep. Yeah, like one thing that comes to mind is we have a water budget. That's required from Here's your landscaping plan, your budget. That's enough front, but then the HOA is established down. They do maintenance, they swap out plants. We're not really there. So that's one thing. Flag, but that's a good point that we can do.
All right. No?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so next topic, improving access and connectivity, just sort of across the board, and some of the, basic recommendations we have are requiring on-site and external pedestrian walkways for multi-unit dwellings, mixed use and non-residential developments, requiring pedestrian access through parking areas, and then also just generally limiting cul-de-sacs and dead-end streets. Go to the next one. Along with that is vehicle parking, a very hot topic nowadays. So there are new, from the legislature, limitations on the ability to set minimum parking requirements for multifamily development in transit corridors. So we will make sure that the regulations align with that.
Can you summarize what that change is, just briefly?
The state one?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can show you maps later. But basically was a law that was passed that comes into effect next summer that looks at all the major roadways in Lafayette as a buffer. It says if there's any multifamily development that's proposed in those areas, you can't require minimum parking. Unless the city goes through quite a few hoops when applications submitted and does its own studies and things like that. So it was a blanket, the bill was essentially a blanket across the cities, and that didn't work through the political process. And so it would scale back a little.
Thank you.
Yeah. But otherwise, we will look at making updates to minimum parking requirements based on either zoning district categories or specific use or development types. And with that comes a discussion about setting maximum vehicle parking limitations, or offsetting parking lots with additional landscaping or pervious surfacing. So really just a conversation that we will have when we're drafting those is about, balancing how much land is used for cars, what that does for the expense of development, and then if it's housing, the expense of housing, as well as still knowing that we are still an auto-oriented place and people have cars. So just finding the balance between those things.
Oops. There was a line in the PDF that I actually literally laughed out loud when I read it. It said, local governments are increasingly leaving parking decisions to developers, allowing the amount of parking provided to be based on what the developer determines to be needed for the development. Why even have a code? Really, the developer's just gonna come out and say, we need 4 spaces or something. So I think that it's important that that be set by the city and not by somebody who has a personal interest.
The funny thing is, every time we've been asked for variance on parking requirements, it's actually to reduce it less than what the code says it should be, not to ask for more parking.
Right, right. I mean, I've never seen a developer come in and say, I would like to include more parking. Yeah, so, and then perhaps that was just an unfortunately phrased sentence, but yeah, I don't think that should be.
Yeah, I appreciate that it's a funny sentence, but there's more to it than that. So, developers need to sell their projects, and they typically don't purposefully underpark them. But regulations almost always require too much parking, which is really expensive. And so what we want to do is find the place where the parking better matches what the market demands, and where we're planning for humans, not for cars. As the city requires additional parking, we're making sure that cars have spaces, but we're taking away from the other things we need, like housing. So I know that could hit you as funny, but it's actually a realistic conversation. The market, as much as, if we go back to Adam Smith and Invisible Hand, it doesn't sound great to have the market do it. The market's also reflected by the banking industry and the insurance industry. They have parking requirements for developers in terms of lending money and insuring projects that may allow a different conversation about right-sizing the parking, particularly as you're looking at being a built-out community. Parking may not be the thing you want to regulate. So let's have that discussion.
Yeah, I'm just not hearing anything from existing residents' standpoint in here, and that was my concern.
I'd also say that in the previous meetings that this group has had, if my memory serves, we had talked about parking in the context of looking at excessive minimums. My recollection of those kind of output of those meetings was there was not a lot of disagreement, fighting amongst us on that topic. We were pretty much on board with looking at. So I have, I think there are excessively high minimum parking requirements in Lafayette. We need to really take a good look at that. And then also, and just again to say it out loud, it was probably understood in the discussion, but the legislature, whatever they're sending down from on high about parking requirements at new multifamily developments here and there, we obviously need to follow that, so on and so forth. But also, let's not lose sight of new commercial, because there's a lot of acres of unused parking lots in Lafayette right now that are full 2 days a year. So keep commercial on there too.
And sometimes the conversation is reversed where there's a tenant for maybe we need this many spaces above what we require, and we're trying to actually suggest that they downsize it a little bit. But yeah, it'll be a good conversation.
Something's got to give.
Yeah.
Okay. 2 more slides. So then another third of the land use code really is the development procedures. And so there we like to collect and draft what we call common review procedures. And so what that means is those kind of steps of the development review process that are applicable to most application types. So a pre-application meeting, a neighborhood meeting, submitting the application, reviewing the application, things that happen after decision. So just having that set of common review procedures, that way you don't have to repeat it over and over again for each specific review procedure. Again, just trying to make it more straightforward, user-friendly. Another big thing that we'll do is looking at the review criteria and the approval criteria and try and move away from subjective approval criteria and replace that with objective. So an example of a common word that we will see in some zoning codes is harmonious? Is the development harmonious with the neighborhood? And to which you ask, what did that mean? And about 12 different people have 12 different interpretations. So trying to move away from that and finding those things that, you know, define harmonious and then making those the objective criteria. Another thing is trying to add some more flexibility to allow for administrative adjustments. Again, we've heard that, you know, the PUD has really become kind of the go-to tool for doing these types of you know, adjustments to setbacks or heights or other dimensional standards. So trying to find a way to make the procedures more flexible so that you can do that in the zone, in a base zoning district. You don't have to go through a whole PUD process just to do that. And then evaluating when non-mandatory public hearings and public meetings are helpful for the project and the community. That way, again, we're really focusing the resources, the community resources, staff resources, into those big projects and really letting the things that are administrative be administrative. And yeah. And then finally, just I'll come back to that. I know you all probably have lots on that one. The final one is just making it a less legal, boring document. So again, Elizabeth mentioned it, it's going to have to be, it is a legal document. It will still read like a land use code, but we do try and get rid of, you know, legalese and too much of the jargon and try and make things as straightforward as possible. Having a clear organization right now, a lot of different things are kind of scattered throughout lots of different chapters for, you know, no rhyme or reason. So really a big part of this is just kind of re-putting together the puzzle of the land use code. And then also trying to add more graphics and illustrations for especially kind of more complicated regulations. That way it's a more visually friendly document as well. Okay.
I mean, I wanted to just come back a couple of slides there.
Yeah.
You know, our discussion about HOAs a few minutes ago, a lot of their standards are very subjective. I got dinged for unsightly conditions on my first day, my HOA, because I had a builder install a blind in the window and they said it was unsightly, and so I couldn't quite understand that. And so I think, you know, if there's a chance to limit the kinds of covenants to have less subjective standards, that might be, I don't know, I don't know what the ability of this is to do that, but that's a place where, you know, your lawn doesn't, you know, your landscaping isn't harmonious with the neighborhood. What does that mean? Everybody else has green lawn, so you have to have it too.
Correct.
And so it's all very subjective. I hate it. I hate it.
That's definitely a theme tonight.
I think this might be a good time to talk about what Karen talked about earlier. I strongly agree with what she said. We residents have worked really hard to add more community input to the development process, especially early in the process, because we were often told, well, this will go before planning commission and city council, and that's when you can comment. And as all the planning commissioners know, you're limited by the code and by you know, so things that could have been worked out early in neighborhood meetings never got worked out. And so that was the impetus behind a lot of having the neighborhood meetings. And so it is concerning to me that things might be decided more at the staff level. One thing that Elizabeth said earlier was things like smaller projects. So how are you going to define a smaller project? This is something that I talked to Jeff Brazel about. One of the benefits, especially in Old Town, to having neighborhood meetings is people know what's going to be going on next door. Because what if something meets code and somebody wakes up one day and the top is being popped on the house next door. That may be a smaller project in the greater scheme of things, but to that neighborhood, it's a big project. And so I think that neighborhood meetings are particularly important in Old Town, where there are no HOAs, there are no, things that people may not feel protected, I would, as in terms of right sizing the development review process, I think always if the earlier public input can happen, the better.
We agree. So earlier in the project is better. One of the reasons we do most of the procedures at the end of the drafting process is so that we can write the standards in a way that works for the community. Sometimes when a code is fragmented or not functional, people are very hyper vigilant because projects can go through and you may not, it could be like the pop-up that you're talking about, and the code doesn't really give you clear understanding of how that can happen. So we don't just want to say, well, staff can approve everything. First, we want to rewrite the regulations. We want to make sure that everybody's on board. So the questions are, okay, what are the rules around which we can make that second story addition administratively approved? Can we write those rules into the regulations? So we start with updating the standards first. Then we start talking about where are we still in a place where the community would like to be involved in the process, where the neighborhood meeting would be meaningful. We do hear from applicants that, and this may not be Lafayette, but we do hear, hey, we had to go through the process of, noticing a neighborhood meeting and nobody showed up. And so we are not advocating taking away the upfront processes that you guys had worked on. We have talked about that with staff about coming into this process. We do want to take the time to put the right standards in place and see if the code can reflect community priorities. If the code can reflect community priorities, then things can be done administratively because people can feel a little more confident that what is being done is what the community agrees to or what the neighborhood agrees to. So we'll try to get through that part of the process first. Then as we get into the procedures, we talk about, okay, this is what we've done in terms of regulatory changes. Where are we still with procedures? This particular slide, I realized as you guys were going through it, it has like a weird twist to it. The current code has like a trigger in it from when a public meeting becomes a public hearing that's confusing almost all the way around. And that's a cleanup that we need to make. But I don't want anyone leaving this meeting saying, Clarion doesn't want any public input on anything. That's completely not correct. We want public input at the right level in the right place. So some of the public input is how do we put the code together? Some of that public input is definitely going to be project specific. And we want to try to get that balance across the next, year and a half as we're doing the project.
My comment earlier about environmental sustainability, resilience, impact statement kind of feel like is a procedural thing, but it's maybe an important one that could catch things that might have been missed. So something that irks me to this day is the pitch of the roof over at the Moore Water Park is pitched so that the roof faces north rather than facing south. And so it's not ideal for solar panels because it's facing the wrong way. Something like that could get caught at a review process like that.
So that would be a little bit difficult given that the site may not lend itself to that kind of orientation. So
yeah, I understand, but it's just I'm thinking of it more as a broad scale review for environmental sustainability, resilience impacts. Maybe early in the process or, at some point in the process where it's not happening at all.
Passive solar is a perfect example of what you're talking about. And I've seen developments proposed to us, looking at these houses and going, half of these could be faced for passive solar, and they're not. And it's like, okay, well, why not? That's your first earliest crack. And sustainability is simply orientation of the building.
Mhm. So there's potentially room to talk about a standard for orientation of buildings to reflect passive solar, which I've never heard of roof pitch pool, but that's a good example. Yeah.
But you're gonna have to struggle with setback issues when you do that, right? So you're putting the applicant in a really tough position. If you're going to require this orientation based on passive, which is a great idea. Everybody wants to do something environmentally so that we're not sucking the life out of the earth that we're living on, right? However, because you also have these other standards that you're choosing based on the fact that the lot is 150 or 35, and there's no way this orientation is going to meet the setback, which means that you have to go to add an adjustment, which means that that's a special use. That means planning commission is involved. So I'm just saying, it's like there's got to be a way in which to assess when it's valuable to make that kind of, say, regulation or the zoning for that particular design.
I'd love to be at that position. I'm just trying to get it to be assessed. I'm not even saying demand is required. I'm saying it needs to be assessed. Should be required. Now, whether it doesn't work out, fine, that's another story, prove it, but at least needs to be assessed.
That might be where you just change that word from recommend to require. You gotta look at it versus.
Okay, so we have this conversation constantly during planning commission where we ask staff to reassess the, the board and bathroom or wherever the material might be, right? There's nothing that compels the applicant to do anything about it because there's nothing in the code that says you have to follow it. Because
Which is what.
That's why we have these
Yeah, let's jump in on that just for a sec. So we use recommend in the code assessment. We don't use recommend in regulations. Regulations are a shall, not a should. So when we move from this document, this framework document into the regulations, we'll be moving into what is required. Sometimes in the area of sustainability, we use menus. So we say, depending on what's going on your site, we want to see the solar orientation, or we want to see that you're doing something in terms of low impact development, that you're doing stormwater mitigation on site, or we set out 3 or 4 things, all of which are acceptable. And then it's up to the applicant to decide what works on that site. And then that works in conjunction with what Gabby was talking about earlier, with allowing staff to do some of those minor dimensional modifications without having to go for a variance for that. So, if you can get the solar orientation, and you need to change your setback by 2 feet because of the way the site works, that should be something that we're okay with staff saying, we're going to let you move it 2 feet into the side setback. You still have plenty of room and you can do solar orientation. So that's how the pieces start building to get to the outcomes that the city wants to see.
Especially for those things that you want to incentivize. So it's, if we're not comfortable having just kind of an across the board, staff can adjust it by 15%, but we know that we want solar orientation, then that could be what the adjustment is for. We see it a lot with affordable housing getting height bonuses, that sort of thing. So again, that's why, kind of the whole the whole code works together, because even all the pieces you just said, that if it needs an administrative adjustment, then it needs a special review. Why does it need special review? Those are all the questions that we'll be asking when we get into it.
Okay, so, I don't want to launch for like a detailed discussion on any of these things, but there were 4 things that, that I wanted to just kind of flag, that jumped out at me from the document, and some of them have been brought up by others already, but the first one, the mention of solar panels on open space. Solar is a priority for Lafayette, but open space is also a priority, and it comes down to battling priorities, and I can, with a lot of confidence, say that that concept is going to get a lot of pushback, stiff resistance. The second thing is planned unit developments. I very much agree on like little minor adjustments ought to be handled at staff level without having to go through the mailers and the public hearings and the planning commission and the city council. But I think we need to be really careful here. I remember Jeff Brazel talking about getting rid of PUDs. And even a former city administrator, Gary Kopacki, had talked about with like this, talking about how giant parts of Denver have been PUD'd out of existence. And that was, to me, one of the big selling points of this kind of form-based hybrid code concept, where that would be a result of that. And now I see in the document here, the recommendations include keeping PUDs. So do we need to do that? If so, there need to be really good reasons that trigger that. Because, and this is just my opinion, but in my view, too much in the past in Lafayette, the PUD concept has been abused as a way for people who simply just don't want to deal with the regulations to do something else. If you go down the list and give tons of examples, but I have a very strong opinion about that. It needs to be a damn good reason with community benefit in mind. If we're going to keep PUDs. Third thing is water. People have touched on it before, and I wholeheartedly agree. And honestly, regardless of whether or not the developer is required to secure their own water supply or not, I mean, how does it actually work? And the staff, as we get into this down the road, staff can comment more, but I've never seen a development turned down because of water considerations. On the other hand, and then at the same time, keeping on doing what we're doing here in the Front Range, I think most people in the city would probably say, yeah, we just can't keep doing what we're doing. You can't say sustainability on one hand and then keep developing to the horizon on the other hand. There's a conflict there. So, but the details in my mind are, how does the process work? If that box on the development application is checked that says, yes, we have the water, is that the end of the story? Or is there more levers that the city has to try to, to guide the development, sustainability in mind? So I don't want to get into that tonight, but I wanted to flag that. And the last thing is the assessment talks about eliminating barriers to redevelopment in downtown. I'd like to know, what are those barriers that need to be eliminated and why? In some cases that may be correct, but in my view, not, especially in a place with a lot of historic integrity like Central Lafayette, not every barrier to redevelopment is a bad thing. So those are my 4 things that just kind of jumped out.
That was mentioned twice.
Quick answer to that one. Not the goal for that is definitely not to like see if someone can bulldoze downtown. The barrier is lack of clarity about what regulations apply to redevelopment. So communities that are seeing redevelopment need to get clear in the regulations about what they will expect of the applicant and when that development will need to meet scale standards. And some of this is what the hybrid form-based does. It says, when you're downtown, you're going to be designed in a downtown manner. But that there's a kind of a black hole in the regulations about how do we get to that place of making sure that redevelopment is going to be done in a sensitive, context-based manner. That is, I can see how you guys would read that broadly, but it should be more of a technical change to the code to make sure that applicants are clear about their requirements and that staff knows what they can apply.
No, I think, yeah, we're certainly in favor of clarity here, so.
Yeah.
Isn't there a relay already on the downtown area that you have to provide?
Residential,
Yeah.
kind of the bookends area, the
Right.
residential areas of Old Town does have a design overlay, that Clarion actually wrote for us in 2017. We'll be looking at making that just a straight zone district, and so there's some things that we have to look at parcel by parcel, because it includes several different zone districts, including a business zone district, so we'll have to sort that out when we get to it.
I have a question on, you mentioned something about flood mitigation on one of your slides, and trying to also bring some of that. Just go back and refresh my memory, because I did have a comment.
Yeah, the word flood is not on that slide. It's in the natural resource one. But because it's, the city has floodplain regulations,
Right,
and
right.
we'll carry them forward, but then we've also heard that they could use some enhancing as well. So we'll work with the city on that too.
Okay, so part of the flood regulations has to do with a very powerful department that you cannot even get a phone call to talk to without actually going through the legislative process. Nobody at CDOT really wants to help you out with this stuff, because they are part and parcel of the issue of flood mitigation. They tell you 95 does not have curb and gutter, and yet a lot of properties on that corner in Lafayette and Lewis are prone to that. It's in fact a very small thing that you can just do. So I'm asking the question, will you be requiring CDOT to be part of this decision so that they understand their role and how, you know, they have to also be part of the solution, because you can't do this independently of the roadway issue.
Public of CDOT?
Anyway, just wanted to mention that as part of ongoing process.
You can add that to the engagement plan. Thank you.
Go ahead.
I was gonna note that on the planning commission, we've had some cases recently where we wished we had an opportunity to see a plan at an earlier big stage, because by the time we see it, you know, we're sort of in a position to protect the best interest of the community, but we're facing into a developer who in many cases has already been through the ringer with multiple staff and maybe multiple boards and years of investment. And it's hard at that point to ask for the changes that feel like our responsibility to ask for sometimes. So I don't know, as we want to keep things efficient, but this could be an efficiency measure for certain types of projects. So just a note that could be helpful.
In the process, years ago, we used to have more cuts at the apple. And then it seems over time, for efficiency's sake, stages have been put together now. Like, okay, so now we basically boil down to PUD and or site plan architectural review as one thing. So all these things at one time instead of, wait a minute, no, let's look at this piece, then let's look at this piece. So when you were talking about the process and what the process is, and I think it's an excellent point. How do we put things in there that give us a more sensible way of going through the process and what we approve?
I would like to piggyback on Seth's comment as far as, it goes back to page 2, summary of community interests. And down on the bottom, it has Lafayette Historical Society helping out with developing Old Town. And I would say you might want to put historic preservation and the Williams kids also.
I'll take that off my list.
Will the Board of Adjustment be eliminated?
Do you want the Board of Adjustment?
Well, you said that now you'll have things, variances within certain zones that can be approved by staff, right?
There would still be the a
But if you
variance.
think about it, if you give this flexibility,
Yeah.
then all of a sudden a bunch of people can go, yeah, I want to add 2 feet to my house.
There's limits to it. It's not just kind of a blanket,
Yeah, because,
yeah.
because the way it's written, it's like, oh, might be out of job. Showing up once or
No.
I'm guessing pretty much every. variance is board of adjustment.
Yeah, particularly because they're not all new built. It would be
Yeah.
a existing condition, right? And those existing conditions were done way back.
I guess, and my point was similar, was are those decisions can be pushed to staff level rather than rise to planning? And it sounds like
I don't know,
that's not the intent.
maybe there's probably.
Well, there's different, the administrative adjustments we're talking about really are minor. You know, we have places that, you know, it's just, you can do setbacks by 10%, but you have to have like topographical, like, like there's a reason that you're asking for it. It's not just an automatic thing. You know, some places only allow like a little, like maybe sign area, or they're very limited, and it's usually based on dimensional standards, like measurable things, so that you can do like 10% is typically what we see, 10 to 20 maybe. And then everything else rises to the level of needing a full variance, which goes through the typical full process that a variance would. So we'll look at those thresholds, but no, we do not intend for every adjustment to be something that staff should decide.
Yeah, one last comment, then I'll be quiet. It's a real quick one. Regarding user-friendly, graphs and illustration are great. Pictures are even better, because the same cookie cutter, full-grown blue tree isn't what it's really gonna look like when we, 5-10 years down the road. And all the cars neatly parked. The reality just doesn't match the illustrations, and so I think it would be better to help sell an effort with, even if it's not Lafayette, representative firms.
So you're saying you want a little creative mess in the graphics just to reflect real life?
When you say pictures, do you mean photograph? Are you saying photograph?
Yes.
Yeah, photograph. But not just clever messiness in the graphic. Yeah.
I've got a few comments about the document that you sent out. And as the longer I've been seeing, the more I've taken off the list, but these are the ones that are surviving. So under the project understanding, you list revised landscaping standards to take into account water and fire. Can you also include wildlife?
Yes, she's
And
aware.
and then below where it says recommendation for dark sky outdoor lighting can require dark sky.
So we need to have a bigger conversation about whether the city wants to go all the way into dark skies regulations or want to use darker skies, because the dark skies process is a little cumbersome. So we'll have that conversation as we move into the outdoor lighting section.
But this is the conversation that Open Space Advisory Board has had about dark sky lighting and how we can limit the impact that lighting has at night for our migrating birds. Lafayette is a tree city USA. It is a migratory bird city USA. It is in the process of becoming a pollinator city USA. If that's the definition.
Yeah.
And know that because of the wildlife plan, we already have a federally endangered species living in Lafayette. So we need to be able to plan for that.
What are your species? Just curious.
Prebles, meadow jumpers.
Thank you.
You will. And then just to echo what's already been said is that the purpose of open spaces is not for solar installations. Thank you. I'm done.
I have a question based on a sentence in the PDF. It says consider a quote, no minimum lot size multifamily district that can be used in the adaptable commercial and Old Town mixed use future land use categories. And I'm wondering what that means.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Yeah, so to get to I think that what we're saying there is just moving away from always using minimum lot size as a measurement for residential uses, and instead allowing, particularly in mixed use categories, residential to go in at different sizes and different scales, and that would need to meet what would become ultimately design standards or site and structure design standards. So that layout would be more governed by the development standards than it would be by the zoning district. So it's just a change of how we look at it and figure out what the baseline regulation is. And that's something that we'll explore and have conversations with you guys about. I hear everyone is very, very protective of downtown, of Old Town, and it's not our goal to make any changes to that. But writing at the level of detail that we have in the code assessment, I can see how it might look like we were, not getting the point. We get the point that there's definitely just a great area with great character in it. And we're just trying to think about how can the regulations allow mix of housing type, mix of uses, all that get developed in a way that works within the city.
I just wanna ask, are we gonna see more attention to bicycle parking? Future, I was, we're talking about duplexes and houses. But, not about business. As far as bicycle.
We'll have short, long-term bike parking.
Quick question about the inclusionary housing, is this, because this wasn't part of the scope before, I don't believe the city had been contemplating that, there's a very short section here, it's about a paragraph. Is that just to bring in incentives, or are you considering an inclusionary housing ordinance, requirements?
Yeah, so
Or is that gonna get teased out in this process?
it'll the latter. So we had, so inclusionary housing for folks that aren't aware is basically a requirement that says the development of residential units needs to set aside a certain percentage as permanently affordable. So that would be a deed restriction against the property that says it can only be sold or rented to a person that makes within a certain income bracket. We used to have that, and it was repealed during around the Great Recession. So we have 20 or so homes that we manage still in that program. And so when we went through the housing plan process, it was identified that we should explore doing that again. So part of the scope here, we got a grant through Proposition 123, which was that statewide referendum a couple of years ago. So we got a grant to do that. And that's paying for this work. And so we're gonna, what we've asked Molly, the consultant, to do is to help us and council and the working group understand the trade-offs of inclusionary housing. What is it? What are the trade-offs? What are the best practices? And what might be the best fit for Lafayette? And then if it's ultimately decided at the policy level with council, then we'll fold it into this process. So we want to make, we weren't 100% sure that all of council and all of the other parties were on board with it. And so there needs to be some education and conversation.
So that's to come as part of this process, though, that the group will be engaged and we'll have conversations around that.
Yeah, there'll be, there's 3 big affordable housing pieces. There's that one, there's an expedited review process that we'll consider for affordable housing projects. And so we wanted to continue with that Proposition 123 grant program after in a few years, then we'll have, that's a requirement. And then the third one is a
I would encourage incentivizing versus mandating. Be pushing for sure. Or is there a fee?
Well, yeah, so a lot of cities would say if you can't accommodate it on site, there's basically, you can pay a fee. Now, a lot of times, in practice, that fee can be multiple projects. The downside is when you have inclusionary housing, it's affordable units are more scattered throughout the city and they're less concentrated, which is a benefit.
So would the code address AMI? affordable housing AMI.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So I think some of the conversation will be about the strategy of where do we want to do the inclusionary housing? Because I think one of the critiques maybe is that it might not make the project not pencil out. And so when you adjust the AMIs higher, so you can make a higher income bracket, it might help in that case. Or with B, then we can use that B.
Yeah, so like the way we deliver large chunks is like Willoughby corner to Willoughby corner, where you can get hundreds of units with a YTech deal and get all the grants and incentives from federal government, state government. But then that delivers a large chunk of affordable housing to help you meet your countywide goals and all that. The downside is you want to spread it out through the city and it's putting it in one spot, but we see that as that's the way to deliver it in meaningful fashion. And I would just caution anything with permanent deed restriction. I always question are you really helping people gain equity in their homes? Or are you providing a temporary housing solution for them? In that case, should it be rental housing or utilizing existing housing stock and not forcing them into a new community with high HOA fees and stuff like that? So
it wasn't repealed because of the recession. Repealed because it didn't work. So I hope you look very closely because some of the issues you're bringing up, as far as the equity, limiting the equity in the building, and also too, the amount that you need to subsidize something to make it work. This is one of the failure points on the previous plan. The developer had to subsidize it and then make it up higher on other units. There's a lot of things you have to really look at very closely. Advise you to look back and see why that one failed, so we don't do the same thing again.
There are plenty of success stories around that too. Like, for instance, Elevations is a lender.
Yeah, we've do lots of projects with Elevations.
To create like what is British English law that somebody else on the line underneath on the actual. So it's a perpetuity. Right. So those are kind of creative things. We think that, but I'm not sure how that. We're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to harp on this, but I mean, we saw with what's that an area behind 9 Mile that was proposed.
Name it.
Yeah, they were coming in. The developer was coming in at 80% AMI, which is not affordable for And so, I mean, that's my concern, that it will be like, oh, we're including affordable housing, but the AMI is so high, it doesn't even count.
And that's something that Root Policies Molly, who he's mentioning, they're economists, and that's something that they look at and that they analyze as part of the whole will inclusionary housing function and how would it best function, is they look at all of those things, is rental at this AMI versus for sale at this AMI. There's a lot of scenarios that they do using.
So we'll get like a report from you.
Yes, they all, yes, you'll get lots and lots of numbers.
Yeah, even affordable housing in Boulder County is expensive. Even the lowest market rate housing is expensive. And that's the reality. There's no getting around that.
But I mean, if developers are asking for concessions based on these high AMIs, which doesn't seem like it's accomplishing what the city wants to.
I think also the AMIs that we're talking about for the Prop 123 are set in the statute. So they can't go above that. There's a statutorily mandated, I believe it's 120% AMI. I haven't looked at the legislation for a little while, but that there will be no range above that qualifies.
Yeah, so as much as we can encourage, smaller homes, I mean, the market's going to dictate the price. There's only so much we can control about the cost of land and the cost to construct. And I always encourage that if we can have the standards that encourage and incentivize smaller lots, smaller homes, workforce housing that the market can support. That's what we prefer to build. So.
Right. It's been a pretty productive meeting. the project schedule would have us meeting again in February, right? And that would be reviewing potential code language around zoning districts. You'll be getting some information. I think we might send that out between 1 and 2 weeks of meeting.
Can we do it on Valentine's Day? We can have land use code love and some balloons and fun treats.
It's just so romantic.
Yeah, you've never had a romantic code before. We can do it.
Well, it's a question, you know, we could look at it February 12th. Folks want to not imperil their relationships, we can look at another date. Too. The week before, the week after.
That's amateur night.
Was,
If you're in a long-term relationship, that's amateur night. Go nuts.
I feel like this happened last year, but is that date work, or should we look at another?
Which date are we talking?
This would be February 12th. Is it not?
No.
When's Valentine's? 14th. This is 14th. This is an amateur eye.
Say, you should put that on
All right,
Yeah.
I think there was another agenda item I was hoping to speak to, and it was about member recruitment.
Yes. Are we wrapping up the working groups portion of the meeting, or do we want to talk about recruitment?
Yeah, I would still be with the whole group, and it would just be a quick question for everyone. So when we initially established this group, we have a group charter, and it has a kind of a list of members. And when looking through this, we have members of the planning commission, reps of every board, and then 5 members of the community. With I guess Seth moving on to historic preservation, he may be the rep for that. And then we have Fatima who moved on to planning commission, so we'll have a couple of vacancies that will fill. Last time we did this, we did a press release, or some postings on city stuff, and we got some applications in for it. And then staff interviewed them and kind of just chose it, but kind of wanted to ask the question, now that the group is formed, does anyone want to participate in any of those discussions with potential members offline between now and February, or is that something you're comfortable with us just doing? Either option is.
Would you keep to the criteria? Because there were those 5 things.
Same criteria. So if Fatima is moving on, we would look for a design or engineering professional. And then with Seth, if you were to move on to that, then it would be a resident residing in Old Town Residential District. That would be who we would be. So what we'll do, we'll put out the feelers through the city channels and start getting some interest, hopefully. And then we can let you know if we get some takers. Cool. That's it for that.
We did public comment at the beginning of the meeting, but there's another opportunity to circle back if there's any.
The postcard idea is a really good one. They, when we did the wildlife plan, when the city did the wildlife plan, when the survey was online, they sent out a postcard to everybody in the city, and the consultants were really with it. They were super happy with it. And also with the Old Town Overlay District, we really have. And so, but the newsletter, I would be cautious of that, because the city really pushed everybody to go to getting their bill online. So I don't get the newsletter. I get it through an email because I subscribe to it. But most people, I don't think, probably are getting it. And I know people who live in apartments don't get it. That's like, you can still use it, but don't count on that as being the big thing. And then on the water topic, it's not just how much water the developer's brain, but it's storage and treatment and all those things have to increase as the population grows. And where do we stand with water right now? When we get all our storage planned out that they're working on, that's just gonna be enough water for the people who live here now. It's not for adding new people. And the treatment plants and all that stuff goes with water. And so the larger the population grows, then we need more of that stuff. And then all of us have to pay for that. So that's something, I don't know how you deal with that with code or if it's possible, but it's something as part of the bigger picture that needs to be thought of. And on the inclusionary zoning, I was watching the city when we put that in place, and it seemed like a great thing. And then when I wasn't watching anymore, and Frank Phillips was on the council, he was on the council that stopped that. So he knows exactly what was presented. That's why he keeps bringing it up. Why that was stopped. And I don't have that information. And I'm always like, what was the deal with that? So I talked to this guy. He knows what the presentation was that made the council say this doesn't work anymore. Because when I was watching, it was hyped as a really good thing. And it sounded great. And it seemed like it was really going to work. And then it came along and it didn't work. And so Frank is well aware of why that happened.
It was hyped as nurses, policemen, firemen, the way to get them in. Not a single one ever bought a house through that program.
Well, then through growth management, there was an incentive to bypass growth management and nobody ever utilized that. All the years that was never utilized. So it's not a naturally occurring thing that developers are gravitating to. It works.
This information is a couple of years old. I think what was presented to the planning commission regarding infill and build out was we're about 10 years away and we're about 10 to 15,000 people away. So our current population plus that in 10 years is when we get to.
The problem is the way these estimates keep changing. 10, 15 years ago, build out was 30,000.
Right.
Now all of a sudden it's 35,000. Build out keeps.
Right, yeah.
Those numbers don't.
Yeah.
No.
That is true. So we are needing to recalculate our projections based on growth management no longer being allowed. And then based on some of these state laws that we'll have to implement, that'll increase housing in certain areas significantly. And then, there's a lot of conversations going on about all the complete picture of water, from storage to treatment. And so that's a big conversation. And now we have a new comprehensive plan that sets a new vision, especially for areas outside the city that could be annexed in the future. And so our public works department that's on their work plan right now. They're working on that. The next, for the current.
But the city already has, okay, so developer number one has to bring a certain amount of water rights with them and hand them to the city. So that's one piece. The other piece is the building fees. They're just fees for different things, but one of them is for sewer, that kind of stuff. Now, granted, those are one-time development fees, but have we looked at, are those sufficient? Are those fees sufficient based on our experience?
I believe they're looking at updating those as part of the separate effort. We'll be updating our affordable housing impact fees. And so that'll be another thing that happens outside of this project. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack probably in this topic. And maybe when we get to one of the future meetings, we can invite Public Works to do a brief presentation or something.
Well, there's the other piece that's not part of just being an additional user. I believe we're spending a lot of money now because the feds came down with new requirements for water treatment as well as for sewage that were very expensive to implement. So I think the city's trying to get that done now. So it's not just an additional user, it's also what's coming down the line in terms of federal regulation that all of a sudden we're not looking for having to put out a bond for 20 or 30 million because of new federal regulation.
So getting too far down the road with this one's probably outside.
Yeah.
But we can certainly bring the experts into the room. ensure your questions are answered.
Any general staff comments for the planning commission being on what we discussed?
I don't think so. There's a lot of implementation around those state efforts that'll include accessory dwelling units that we're working on right now. That'll go through an engagement process, probably in the next month. We'll start talking about that. And then there's other issues that we're working on too. Planning commission will have a meeting like next week, and we'll be considering a couple of code amendments there as well.
For the public and planning commission, the normally scheduled meeting 2 weeks from now has been canceled, but we are meeting next week in lieu of the 27th, we're meeting on the 20th.
Does everyone have that?
It's great about retirement.
That's a special.
Sure.
The agenda will be up tomorrow.
Any other commissioner comments?
Well, yeah, but I guess I'll just keep up. I attended a meeting of the Boulder County Vision Zero.
Yeah, you're the senior on the transportation committee.
Well, senior to you, but
I just moved it up.
But anyway, so that's actually a very, very interesting thing that they're going through. It's Boulder County, Superior, and Lafayette are all looking at eliminating traffic deaths and designing going forward, looking at designing also to not only reduce them, but to look at, how we can reduce human mistakes in transportation. And they're using crash data from 10 years from CDOT. I don't know how they managed to get that. It was from January 2013 to December 2022, so fairly current data. And then they have sort of two things they mapped out, which was the high injury network, which is current based on that data, where some of the high frequency accidents and dangers occur. And then translating that into a higher risk network, which is going to be the future, which is going to then use that data to make projections as to where else or how we can reduce based on the traffic design of the network. So they're going to actually have an outreach on that in early 2025. So there'll be more to come, find out what that outreach is going to be. But they're going to present recommended actions to the communities that are participating, and then we can then use those to integrate into our traffic plan, and hopefully then make that kind of flow into this process as well. But it's going to be a lot of fancy footwork here to make this all work together. It looks like it's going to be a really helpful product with that process. Thank you.
Any other commissioner comments? I think we're ready to adjourn the meeting one last call. The meeting is adjourned.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Elizabeth.
I appreciate it.